words, and we'll also be integrating in Fry and other traditional sight word or high frequency word lists. So very excited about this training, super practical and something you can bring to the classroom immediately.
Very good. Okay, we're going to get started. We are in our final session today. We've been doing this since January, and it's been once a month. It's been great, but May is special because we have 2 events. And Denise Eide, is that how you pronounce your name? Eide or Eide?
It is Eide.
Eide. I've been saying it wrong for 4 months. But we're here today for our final session, and today we're talking about handwriting. And at the end, we're going to review we're going to go over again the sessions that we're going to have in June and July, so everyone can hear that, and so we can record that. So everyone that watches this will see that. So without further ado, Denise, it's all yours.
All right, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for taking an evening to learn about handwriting, and I hope you've been enjoying this series. So tonight's session is called Teaching Handwriting with Success, and I want to begin with this question: do we still even need to teach handwriting? Because this is a question that I often am asked by parents, by teachers, and the reason that I think a lot of people ask this question is how little we often write by hand anymore. So much of what we do is keyboarding. So this question comes up of, well, do we need to teach handwriting if most people are going to be using a type or a computer? But I want to point to a study that helps us to understand the importance of teaching handwriting explicitly. There was some research done at the University of Marseille where they taught adults a new alphabetic system. And one group of adults, they taught how to type that system. And another group of adults, they taught how to write that alphabet by hand. And when they tested them later, they found that the group of adults who had learned to write the alphabet by hand had actually better retention of the sounds and the code of that writing system than those who had learned to type it. In addition, they found in functional MRI studies that when they were reading that alphabet, they were actually triggering some of the sensory motor areas of their brain. So one of the conclusions of this study was when writing by hand, the movements involved leave a motor memory in the sensory motor part of the brain, which helps us to recognize the letters. So a big takeaway from this is that handwriting is also about helping us to learn the sounds and the code, the written code. So in the science of reading, we talked about a presentation, we talked about how the brain loves complex patterns. And if you look at these ducks and you stop and you think, gosh, a 3-year-old can say each of these is a duck, even though they're very, very different, it's because the brain is really good at figuring out what is the same about each of these and what are the distinguishing factors that make a duck a duck. And interestingly, handwriting is part of the process we've now know from neuroscience that helps children identify what are the important parts that make a letter the letter. So if you look at this group of letters, they are all different and they all represent different sounds. And we've all been taught that through instruction. But how do we help a student learn that they're all different? Well, one of the best ways is through handwriting. And notice, it's fascinating, right? Because when you look at this group of letters, we know that they all say "b." They're all the same phonogram, but they all look different. So it's just like that analogy or that skill that a student can recognize all those images of ducks as ducks, that they can learn to recognize all of these as a B that says "b." So I want to dig a little deeper into how to teach handwriting and how you kind of experience some of this, and then we'll come back to the neuroscience as well. So I think the best way to try to wrap our minds around this is to learn a little bit of Russian together. So I would encourage each of you to take out a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen, and I'm going to have a demonstration where I'm going to teach you a new language. And if any of you speak Russian, I'm so sorry about my very horrible accent, but I think it'll still work out well for us. So we're going to learn our first Russian phonogram. And this phonogram says ch. Go ahead and say ch with me. Can you all do that? Ch. All right. So this says ch. And when we write ch, it looks like this. So by the way, that's the book face version. And when we write ch, I'll show you what it looks like, and then I'll teach you how to write it. So it looks, can everybody see that like this? Does everyone see that? Can you put up some thumbs up so I know that everyone's able to find my little window where I'm showing the written? Good.
We can see it.
Perfect. Just wanted to make sure. All right, so this says ch. Now, it's interesting, in Russian, they always teach cursive first, and so they don't have an equivalent of manuscript like we do. So this is like writing a cursive ch. And so what do you notice is the same between this cursive version and the book face version? And you can go ahead and type in the chat box what is the same. So you'll notice that this shape here is the same, but you'll notice there's some swing strokes or some like connector strokes that are different. So here's how we write ch. What I'd like you to do is draw some lines that are solid and a dotted line on your paper that are big. So start with some big lines because we're going to learn how to write ch using large motor movements. So you'll start at the midline and you'll swing up to the top line, and then you'll swing down to the baseline, swing up to the top line, down to the baseline, ch. All right, let's do that together. It becomes swing, down, ch. Let's do it again and be saying the swing and down and the sound with me. Swing, down, ch. Are you beginning to kind of feel that shape? All right, you can also do this with your finger in the air. Swing, down, ch. So this is large motor movement of learning how to write this. And then you can write it with your hands. So it can become swing, down, ch. And what I actually meant to say is you can write it with your pen. Swing, down, ch. All right, so what does this say? It says ch. All right. In Russian, they have this same phonogram and it says aw. So go ahead and say aw with me, aw. And the way that aw looks when it is written is like this. I'm going to write it for you. Now notice it looks the same as how we write it, right? When we write an A in cursive, we write it this way. And I can separate these out for you right now. So it's the same thing, but this says aw in Russian. And we can talk about how there's two forms of aw in Russian. There's this book face form and there's this written cursive form. Just like in English, we have to teach that these both say aw. And here's how you form an aw. So place your finger on the baseline. Okay, everyone got that? Curve up to the midline, roll around to the baseline, swing up to the midline, down to the baseline. Aw. Let's do it one more time. Put your finger on the baseline, curve up to the midline, roll to the baseline, swing up to the midline, down, aw. So this becomes curve, roll, swing, down, aw. One more time. Curve, roll, swing, down, aw. And again, we can do this large motor too. Curve, roll, swing, down, aw, or with air writing. In fact, you can even translate it and do it with your foot. I don't know if I can lift up my foot high enough for the screen, but you can imagine curve, roll, swing, down, aw. So these motions in the body can translate, you can do them with your hands, with your feet, and you can practice and begin to experience those shapes that combine together to make the sound aw. Let's practice ch again. Swing down, ch. And then curve, oh wait, curve, roll, swing, down, ah. So I just want you to be feeling those sounds. All right, now this sound is very, very tricky to say. And so in Zoom, it might even be trickier. So just listen really carefully. So this says E. Okay, now probably you're thinking, well, what's so hard with E? Well, in Russian, there are two different sounds of E and E, and they sound different to a Russian speaker. Now, if you didn't grow up speaking Russian, they might sound the same to you. So this would be like having an auditory differentiation difficulty in English, where you struggle to hear the difference between two sounds. However, to hear, you can also feel the difference between how these sounds are said or pronounced. And this goes back to our very first phonemic awareness session, where we talked about a kinesthetic awareness of sounds. So if you place your hands on your lips and you pull them back, E, this is E as if it didn't have that little curve over the top, E. This little curve means it's a soft E, and it says E, like this. Someone's just joining. I'm doing a handwriting demonstration and I'm teaching you a Russian word, and this is the last letter. All right, so this Russian phonogram says E, and it's actually the soft E, not E, E. So can you feel the difference in your own mouth? This is E. All right, so here's how we write it. And again, if you're joining, this is a little late. I'm doing a demonstration using another language, and we'll circle back around and apply this to English. So here's what this looks like in Russian. It looks like this. And so I would help the student compare. How are these the same? How are they different in book face and in handwriting? And we'd talk about how these lines are the same and how the curve is the same. And they both say E. All right, let's learn how to write it. Place your finger on the baseline, swing up to the top line, down to the baseline. I'm sorry, let me start again. Place your finger on the baseline, swing up to the midline, down to the baseline, up to the midline, down to the baseline, curve, E. Got it? Let's try it together. Swing down, E. Swing down, E. All right, let's go ahead and put this all together. So you have a word in Russian. Can you sound it out? And go ahead and write in the chat box the English equivalent to this word, if you can figure it out. What does this say if you sound it out? There's a cognate in English. Anyone got it? So I'll help you out. It says ch, I, chai. So this means chai in Russian, which many of us recognize as the word chai, meaning the kind of tea with spices and milk. And it is related to that Indian word, but in Russian, it means black tea, chai. So that same word that is spelled like this. So the reason I tried to pull this together for you was to help you see how handwriting can become integrated into phonics instruction. So let's go on and look now at English words. And before we do that, I want to talk for a moment about also another reason to teach handwriting. So this is a picture of a student's handwriting that hadn't been taught systematic instruction and how to write. And when students, and it was, by the way, it was a 12-year-old student. When students have poor handwriting, they also feel really badly or embarrassed about it, and they're not comfortable writing and communicating. So another reason that we need to teach handwriting is to give students the confidence to communicate in written language and for their handwriting to match their age and their level of expression. So before you begin to instruct handwriting, you need to choose a style of handwriting. And in this case, what I mean by style is, do you begin with manuscript or do you begin with cursive? Now, I'm going to make some arguments as to why teach cursive first. However, I want you to know that the most important thing is not if you teach manuscript or cursive first, it's that you teach systematically. However, if you're in a place, in a teaching situation where you have the ability to choose, or you have some room in your curriculum to choose, I recommend beginning right from the very beginning with 4- and 5-year-olds with cursive. So why is that? Well, in manuscript, many students struggle with reversals, and being able to tell B and D apart, again, is related to that letterbox region of your brain not being sensitive to mirror images. However, in cursive, the letters are much more difficult to reverse, and so most kids don't struggle with reversals when they're taught cursive first. This is also true with P's and Q's. Another problem that students have with beginning with manuscript is spacing. And I'll demonstrate a little bit of this later, but it is really difficult to get the spacing correct in manuscript because of how the letters are formed. And so if you do choose to start with manuscript, you'll need to spend a lot of time on spacing. But when you learn in cursive, the letters are connected within a word, and you pick up your pencil to form a new word, and that resolves all issues with spacing. So students learning cursive first don't have that difficulty. Also, at least with the rhythm of handwriting and many cursive programs, not all of the lowercase letters begin in the same place at the baseline. And if you instruct handwriting, you know that students often begin the letters in different places and begin formation in different places. And then that creates inconsistencies in their handwriting. So it's much simpler when you're teaching cursive if all of the lowercase letters begin in the same place, and that is the baseline. By comparison, manuscript letters begin in 7 different places. So when instructing manuscript, you need to tell students start at the midline, start at the top line, start halfway between the midline and the baseline, you get the idea. So they start in 7 places. Also, this was a big aha moment to me, but in the United States, cursive was taught first in our education systems until the 1940s. So my grandfather had, I think, a 6th or 7th grade education, and he wrote in beautiful, perfect cursive, and he was never taught how to write in manuscript. It was really fascinating to me when I was a child, because he would, when he had to fill out a form, he'd have to think about it really carefully, whereas his cursive was beautiful and really natural. Now, it's not that he couldn't write in very clear and good manuscript, it's just it was clear that his cursive was his chosen handwriting style, and that was because he was taught cursive first. And that was true in our schools until the 1940s. And there was a big shift as how we instructed reading also shifted. In addition, cursive is still taught first in many schools and in many languages around the world. So this is just a picture that a friend sent me of a French early reader that was also typed in cursive to reinforce that students were learning cursive in school. Now, most of their books, just like us, are printed in bookface, and students learn to read in bookface and write in cursive. But in order, they even printed some of their books because their kids are learning cursive right from the beginning. And so just a mind shift, right? Just like I was saying in Russian, students learn cursive and then they read in bookface. So cursive is the kind of writing that was designed for the human hands. And if you take just a moment and you take a pencil and you write the word teacher first in cursive, you'll notice that it takes, you only pick up your pencil at the end. Then write teacher in manuscript. And you'll notice there's a lot more fine motor movement of lifting your pencil between the letters. So cursive uses less fine motor, and it was the form of print designed to make it easy to write with the human hands. Manuscript was actually designed for the printing press. And it was used so that you could set up these blocks and they could be easy to typeset. And then later we decided to match how we wrote to the way it looked on the printing press. But that, like I said, isn't necessary. And many other countries don't do that, or other languages. So I'd like to do a little survey. And if you don't mind using your thumbs up button for this survey, the first question I have for you, here I'm going to make my box of people bigger so I can see more of you. The first question I have for you is, how many of you write in beautiful, perfect cursive all the time? Give a thumbs up if you do. Okay, a handful of people. Go ahead and take your thumbs down. How many of you write in Manuscript all the time? Okay, a handful of you. How many of you blend cursive and Manuscript? All right, so do you notice, and by the way, this is a majority of Americans. A majority of Americans blend cursive and Manuscript. Now, the reason for this is because we were taught Manuscript first, and then we developed the muscle memory to write in Manuscript for 3 years. And developing that muscle memory takes a lot of effort. And then when we got to, say, 2nd or 3rd grade, depending on your school, we were taught to write in cursive. And many of us were very excited to learn to write in cursive. However, we now had all of this muscle memory for Manuscript. And it's very difficult to overcome that muscle memory. So then it results in this blend, because cursive is faster and easier for the human hand, but you have all this muscle memory that you've developed through the years that's difficult to overcome. So I don't know if any of you are musicians, but just one other thing about muscle memory and the relationship to handwriting is this. If you're a musician, you will have had this experience where it is much easier to slow down and learn the piece correctly the first time than it is to learn the wrong muscle memory and have to go back and reteach that muscle memory to correct it. Do some of you know what I'm talking about? So muscle memory is part of how we learn. So if you want students to write in fluent cursive, the best way to develop that skill is to teach it from the beginning. And then in 2nd or 3rd grade, to teach Manuscript as a unit so that they can use Manuscript for very specific situations, such as writing out on a form or writing on a map, or the situations where it's appropriate to use Manuscript. So that's my thought. Now, I want to be really, really careful to tell you that, well, let's go further reasons to teach cursive first. So you have a lack of issues with reversals. The letters are connected, so you solve all the spacing issues. The lowercase letters all start at the baseline, so that is easier for instruction. However, the most important piece, and I want you all to hear this clearly, is systematic instruction. So the reason to teach Manuscript would be that your school or your state or your district requires it. It's also, if you're adopting other new pieces in your curriculum, changing your handwriting program can be really overwhelming to educators. And once again, the most important piece to handwriting instruction is systematic instruction. You can have all the kids writing beautifully in Manuscript if you teach systematically. So let's dig into how to teach, or let's see, what's next here? Let's dig in a little bit to why to teach systematically, and then we'll do a few demonstrations in English. So do you remember, again, this idea that the brain is really good at human patterns, or at patterns? Many people ask this question, well, isn't it too difficult to learn to write in cursive because the cursive letters look different? However, we need to remember that bookface and Manuscript letters also can look very different from one another. So the key is explaining that these are all the same. They all say a, ah. And again, that's like our ducks. Here's another example where the cursive has these connector strokes, but notice a G or a G, J has different forms in bookface, and we need to draw those connections even if we're teaching Manuscript. So this skill of identifying that these are all G, J is very important no matter which form of handwriting you're teaching. So no matter what form of handwriting you're teaching, an excellent way to help your students master the phonograms is to present them with different fonts, different styles, and have them match them. Which of these are the same? Because once again, that's partly how the brain masters the patterns and will then learn at a and that letterbox region will be formed. You should also do this in cursive, right? Matching book face to cursive so that students develop those relationships, or book face to manuscript, if that's the form of handwriting you're teaching. So how do we teach handwriting? What are the steps and what is the goal? The goal of handwriting is to develop rhythmic, automatic muscle memory. So you can, if you want to take a big takeaway for handwriting instruction from this away, from tonight, it's this. The goal of handwriting is to develop rhythmic, automatic muscle memory. And what we know is that kids who write fluently have a rhythm to their handwriting. Kids who struggle with handwriting, you'll see them start and stop and they're uncertain. And they have to put a lot of cognitive effort into just thinking about how to write something. But when you have rhythmic automatic muscle memory, you can put all that cognitive effort into what you want to write or communicate. Does that make sense? So developing that muscle memory helps you to then have the skill to be able to communicate fluently without needing to pause and think about it. So how do you develop that rhythmic automatic muscle memory? So where I like to begin is to begin with large motor movements. So you'll notice when we learned the word chai, I began with large motor movements. What's a large motor movement? The movement's coming more from your elbow or your wrist as opposed to your fingers. Why begin with large motor movements? Large motor movements help us to experience that shape with a lot of clarity. Fine motor movements are a little bit more abstract. However, the thing that we know about motor memory is this. If you can do it large motor and you have fine motor, you'll be able to translate that skill. Just like when you could do it large motor with your hand and you could do it large motor with your foot. Does that make sense? If you have fine motor movement, that muscle memory will translate. So that's a really cool aspect of how motor movement works. Then I like to begin with strokes. So you can have tactile cards. We sell tactile cards that have the strokes. This is the swing stroke. And I like to begin with start at the baseline, swing up to the midline. Now you can make a card like this with glitter glue. This is not something you have to purchase, but a tactile experience of the stroke. So let's go ahead and practice it together. Start it, and you can do this just by drawing these lines on your paper. Sometimes I would just put a chart that's hand drawn and we'd practice it large motor movement. Start at the baseline, swing up to the midline. So very simple. Then we can teach our next stroke. Our next stroke looks like down. Start at the midline, down to the baseline. We might show that little hook. Go ahead and practice that, down. Everyone, go ahead and practice it down, large motor. Then we have the one dot. So we could talk about dot between the midline and the top line, dot, that large motor movement. So once we've learned strokes or a few strokes, what I like to do is I like to teach lowercase letters first. Why lowercase letters? Because lowercase letters make up 95 or 98% of all that we read and write. We use uppercase letters only at the beginning of sentences and in with proper nouns. So when you teach uppercase letters, I like to teach them when I teach the purpose of them. Does that make sense? So that we're not getting uppercase letters mixed in all over the place. Instead, we want things written in lowercase, and then we teach the usage of uppercase. I also like to group them based on initial stroke. So rather than teaching A through Z, just A, B, C, D, I begin to teach with initial stroke. So one option, it doesn't matter which initial stroke you choose, but one option is swing, because there's a bunch of letters that begin with a swing stroke. Now we have a little handwriting chart that groups them by stroke. And so these are all the swing letters. You could also start with curve like A. but then you might teach A and D because they all start with curve. Now, why do you start with stroke? Remember, the goal of handwriting is automatic rhythmic muscle memory. So if you start by teaching all the letters that begin with that stroke, swing, you're developing muscle memory for swing. Does that make sense? And you're practicing that over and over and developing that muscle memory. So let's learn this phonogram, which if you've been part of the series, what I like to do with emerging readers and writers is to introduce it in book face. And I'll say, this says I, I, E, ya. And I'll have them say the sounds with me, I, E, ya. And if they're young, we'll march I, E, ya. We'll practice the sounds. And then I will, on the very same day, introduce, and this is how we write I, E, ya. And I'll show them, just like I have on the screen here, how it looks in handwriting. And by the way, if you're doing Manuscript, do the exact same thing. Does that make sense? Just show them side by side. And I'll say, how are they the same? Oh, they both have a dot. They both have a line. How are they different? Oh, this one, this I, E, ya for handwriting, that has connector strokes. And I'll just explain, that makes it easier for your hands to connect it to other letters to write words. So we've compared them. We know they both say I, E, ya. And then I'll demonstrate how to write the phonogram step by step using large motor movement and explicit instructions. So that's where we get out, again, these large motor lines. Start at the baseline, swing up to the midline, down to the baseline, dot, halfway between the midline and the baseline. And you can slow that down as much as the student needs. If you need to go swing up to the midline and they do that, down to the baseline and they do that, pick up your pencil, dot. And I want the student to say those instructions because I want them to understand how it's oriented on the lines, how it's written. And then after they're able to do that, we will drop that down to just saying the strokes. Swing, down, dot. I, E, ya. Swing, down, dot. I, E, ya. Now, the idea of that is to emphasize that rhythm. Does that make sense? To give them those strokes, to emphasize the rhythm and show those how to come together. So we have tactile cards with this and all these sorts of pieces. But again, what I want to emphasize is not so much that you need to use rhythm of handwriting, but the idea that you need to teach explicitly to students how to form it, take that initial time for instruction, make sure they're getting a rhythm to it, getting that motion down fluidly, make sure they know the sounds. And if you've accomplished that, you will save them so much time in their education. I can't tell you the number of schools that I consult with where I get their whole elementary school staff in the room and we start to talk about handwriting. And the second and third grade teachers will say, I have so many students coming into my classroom who are struggling with handwriting that I have to re-instruct each year. So if you're teaching kindergarten and first grade, really emphasize this so that your students have mastered it so that they can really be focused on writing. And then make sure you're teaching it the same across your sections in your classroom so you have a common language for handwriting. All right, so have the student then practice writing the phonogram while saying the sounds aloud, the rhythmic directions aloud followed by the sound. So I just have the student do swing down dot, I, E, ya. Swing down dot, I, E, ya. So they really have it mastered. And we have them then practice large motor. So notice you can use a whiteboard. This student is practicing just with a laminated set of lines that were then put on a laminate board. That's fine. We have people who practice with chalk. I've been to schools where it's super fun to see them. They're bringing their kids outside and they're practicing handwriting out on the sidewalk because they're using large motor skill. You can use the whiteboard, anything that gets them practicing that kind of large motor movements. Now I want to demonstrate one more and then we'll talk about fine motor. So notice this phonogram says u, u, How many sounds is that? It's 4. Let's say them together. U, u, And we'll compare, how is the cursive different from the book face? Oh, you're right. It's just the swing strokes that are different. How are they the same? They have the up and down line. So that same dialogue to get the student paying attention to what an u, looks like. And then we will learn how to write it. And it becomes start at the baseline, swing up to the midline, down to the baseline, swing up to the midline, down to the baseline. U, And once I can see the student can do that, it'll become swing down, u, Now, the same thing happens, right, with curved letters. It becomes curve, roll, swing down, a, aw. And again, I'm kind of jumping ahead there, but does that make sense to you how you might integrate those strokes into a rhythm with the sounds? So once you've done the instruction in how to write some of the letters, you can begin to combine them into words. And when you do that, you're going to need to teach students how to connect or space, if you're doing manuscript, letters to form words. And so when you instruct with cursive, one of the nice things is all of the lowercase letters begin at the baseline. And so you'll be able to, in a word like cat, it just flows. It becomes curve, roll, swing down. And they don't have to say all those strokes at that point, but you'll see that it really develops this rhythm and it just flows into each other once they know those strokes. So that becomes simple. The one challenge with cursive is that there are some letters like O that end with a dip connector. And so when I introduce how to connect something to an O or to another letter that ends with that dip connector, I talk about how it's like O is extending its hand and the T is holding up its foot. And I might even have 2 students kind of model that just to be silly and show how, the O is ending up higher. But it's interesting in the formation of the letter because it doesn't really change a lot. So if you write an O, curve, roll, dip, it just goes into a little baby swing for the T. So if that makes sense, it's still a swing, it's still there. And so we just explicitly talk about that. And most kids get it really, really quickly, like almost immediately. Now, if you're teaching manuscripts, again, you're teaching the strokes. You're talking about start with the C. You're talking about start halfway or, a little ways below the midline, roll for the C. Now, notice with the A, you begin at the midline and you roll again. And you have to leave room for that roll. That's a pretty interesting visual challenge. So a lot of times kids don't leave enough room for that roll. And so then it's too tight with the C. And then that T is coming up and it's straight and they overcompensate. Do you see that? Because then they're like, oh goodness, that's too close. Now, oh no, now that's too far. Okay, so what I want you to gather from this is that this is just hard. It just takes some practice. So be sure to give them plenty of time practicing this because they'll get it, but it's a visual spatial challenge in a way that cursive is not. I also like to encourage students to leave at least 2 or 3 finger spaces between words when they're first starting, because look at that word sat too, that's rolling back as well. And they might accidentally put it too close and it'll start to look like cats. So kind of making that space between words bigger if they're beginning with manuscript. All right, so we've been talking a lot about large motor. And I think one of the things that I'd like you to take away with no matter which handwriting program you're using is you can teach handwriting large motor. Many people think of handwriting as a fine motor skill, but it's really important that you can and begin to think about how you could teach it large motor as well, because many kids don't have good fine motor skills starting kindergarten. And in fact, I've spoken to some physical therapists and occupational therapists who have said that as kids have been using more and more touch screens, and doing less and less work with like fine toys like Legos and things, they're actually coming to school with less developed fine motor skills than they were a generation ago. So in this generation in particular, it's going to be important to give them lots of large motor writing practice that they can be successful at, even if they haven't developed those fine motor skills. So then we need to teach students how to hold a pencil. And I get so many questions about holding a pencil, but my preference on this is to let students have some choice. You can hold it with these 3 fingers, you can hold it, bent here, but you need to be able to gather fine motor motion. So that's the goal. If you hold it in a way like this, can you write fine motor with your fingers? No. So there's some room for some personal choice. Some people do a 2-finger hold, some do a 3, but again, they have to be able to move their fingers for fine motor. And a really great way that you can help kids who are struggling with this, and it's uncomfortable, right? Especially if you don't have good fine motor skills, it's really uncomfortable to develop this, is to get a variety of pencil grips. So some of the pencil grips have 2-finger options, some have 3, some have slightly different finger placements where the fingers are. And what I like to do is have an assortment. And they all have to encourage this fine motor grasp, right? Because we don't want kids just picking it up with a grip like this or like this. And then say, whichever one feels best to you, you get to use, but you need to be able to develop fine motor. Does that make sense? So you get some choice, you can help them to feel like they have some control over this discomfort, but also helping them to develop fine motor. The other thing is I don't like to force young students who don't have good fine motor skills to write fine motor. So you'll notice in our programs that there are worksheets with handwriting, but there's very clear teacher tips. And again, this is something you can extend to any curriculum, that if the student doesn't have fine motor, give them a whiteboard where they can write large motor. Give them other alternatives where they can practice those skills and still be working on writing letters, and then help them develop fine motor separately. So again, using Legos, putting screws and nuts and bolts together, eyedroppers and water, anything that gets this motion going that might feel like play can help them develop those skills. Once those fine motor muscles are developed, that muscle memory will translate, and it's pretty miraculous, but it's really neat to see how that works. So if they're upset, does that make sense with the fine motor movement? Make that play and practice writing large motor. Another thing that is important is to teach kids to tilt the paper. So I get so many questions about why are the letters slanted in Rhythmic handwriting programs. And it's because it's reflecting how we hold our paper. And I like to do a little demo with all of you. So if you take out a piece of paper and you orient the lines, it needs to be lined, and you put it perpendicular to yourself. And then you open and close your elbow. And I'm going to do this here, and it's kind of hard to see it. If the paper is straight up perpendicular to me, do you see how the natural opening and closing of my elbow doesn't follow the line of the paper? So when that happens, then students end up with their shoulders really crunched and then moving out, and ergonomically it's not comfortable, and then it's hard to follow the lines. But if you tilt your paper, and if you're left-handed, it's the opposite direction, but if you tilt your paper at an angle, you can get it so that opening and closing of your hand follows this curve, and then you're opening your elbow this way, as opposed to this awkward motion. And it's that tilting that generates the slant. So if you write the same letters straight up and down, they'll be straight. And if you write them with a tilted paper, they're slightly slanted. So that's where the slant comes from. It comes from tilting the paper. It's not fancy, it's not italic, it's just a reflection of the ergonomics of the directionality of the paper. All right, so if you teach cursive, please teach Manuscript in 2nd or 3rd grade, teach the other form. And if you start with Manuscript, please teach cursive later, just like you're probably doing. And I encourage you to find a program that has a relationship, a tight relationship between the two, because this will also really facilitate instruction. So you'll notice that at a when it's in cursive, becomes curve, roll, swing, down. Well, what's removed is this curve stroke and this little bit of the swing. So it becomes roll, swing, straight. They're very, very similar. And almost what disappears when you move to Manuscript is the little connectors. And instead you're lifting up your pencil between them. So if your program tightly correlates the instruction of the 2 letters, it will facilitate the transition. All right. Here's another big, big takeaway for you, which might mean some changes to how you instruct. Do not use worksheets that trace. So oftentimes handwriting is not taught with direct instruction. Instead, we give students these dots to form. The problem is that some students will begin at the bottom and some will begin at the top, some will begin in the middle. They don't really have the instruction on where to begin. And in addition, when they do motor movement examples, when a student has a dot to dot, they begin to do things like this. They connect the dots. And is that rhythmic automatic muscle memory? No. So even if they're following the motion correctly, they're not developing curve, roll, swing, down, that automatic muscle memory. So instead of using dot to dots or tracing, invest in that direct instruction and then have them write on lines. Now, here's some ideas for large motor practice if you want some extras, because I find large motor practice really helpful. So you can use finger paint, you can use shaving cream on a tray, sidewalk chalk, whiteboards. I've seen people actually paint window paint and practice writing that way. I've seen people put paint in Ziploc bags and just create the sensory tables, salt boxes. We had some video in a classroom, I think it was a 1st grade, that I thought it was great. The kids were rolling out Play-Doh and they were using their pencils, and it was dragging through the Play-Doh, and so it's very high sensory, and they were then experiencing those letters, and they were actually practicing their spelling words and handwriting in Play-Doh, and then they'd roll it out between each word. So be creative. And by the way, when you mix it up like this, students get really engaged, right, in the instruction. They think it's fun and it's different. Sandpaper letters are great. Tactile cards are great. You can do glitter cards. They can make their own. Treasure hunts. Sometimes I would hide letters around the room, and then they would find them, and it'd be like, have them read curve, or say it, curve, roll, swing, down, at a as they read them, and so turn them into games. So let's talk about copy work too. Another way that people often practice handwriting is to copy. And I want to just discourage that. If they don't know how to form the letters well, don't have them copying. Otherwise, it's more like art. But if they can read that sentence and you've instructed them how to write it, then they can copy it. Also, choose appropriate line sizes. Something that was kind of a big aha moment to me in my education was realizing that a 4 or 5-year-old has a really tiny hand. And many 4 or 5-year-olds write better really, really tiny because their hands are really tiny. Other kids write better on those big lines that we often give them. So this is another area of choice that we like to give students. Which size line feels best to you? And we do this as adults too, college rule, wide rule. Teach 1 phonogram a day if you're teaching 3 or 5-year-olds, or every few days. And teach them the sounds and how to write them. And again, practicing with play and sensory, emphasizing large motor instruction, and learning the lowercase phonograms, beginning with initial stroke. If you're teaching older students or remediating students who already know how to write, who are 6 or 7-year-olds, it's really fascinating. We've worked with kids and seen them in summer camps and in programs where we've taught the whole group of swing letters in one day. And by the way, if kids struggle with handwriting, it's also a really great time to switch, because they often want to learn cursive anyway. So if their manuscript is really hard to read, you'll oftentimes be able to see that same student go from writing like many grade levels belowhand to writing like an adult with systematic instruction. And I've seen so many kids really motivated. They feel really good about themselves. But you can teach, 4 or even the whole group of letters by stroke in a single day in practice. So I have a section here on how the brain learns to read, and I'm going to try to go through it just really fast. I know I'm running over, but I just want to draw one last connection about why to teach handwriting. So just to review from the neuroscience of reading, reading starts as a visual input. It then moves to the letterbox or visual formation area of the word, where it then connects into the parts of the brain that recognize sounds and eventually into the area of meaning. And again, you can see the neuroscience video to see this again. But what I want to emphasize is the letterbox is that visual word formation area that before we learn to read is used for facial recognition. And the significance of the letterbox being facial recognition is it's the area of the brain least sensitive to mirror images, because a child needs to recognize that a person is the same person, whether they see the left or the right side of them. And handwriting, research has shown that handwriting is the best way to train the brain that these are different, to sensitize the brain to mirror images. So there's just a number of studies that talk about this. And since I'm running out of time, I'm just going to share one. And I thought that this study was super interesting. So researchers taught 4-year-olds the sounds of the alphabet. And they were able to see in functional MRIs that this whole group of 4-year-olds did not have that letterbox region of their brain activated for letters. So when they saw a letter, it activated a different part of their brain for shapes. They were still using the letterbox for facial recognition. So they taught one group to just look at the letters and say the sounds. And they practiced them for 4 weeks. And then they taught another group to write the letters and say the sounds. And what they found was there was more brain activation in the group that learned to write in the letterbox region. So I just think it's super fascinating to see this connection that handwriting is also about effective reading and instruction. All right, so I am going to pause there so that we can get to questions.
Okay, can you see the chat, Denise?
I can, and I'm switching over so I can, hopefully you can see me. All right.
So there's only a couple. If students are taught to write in cursive from the beginning, will they be able to transfer that over to books, which are printed and not written in cursive?
Yes, absolutely. Students do this in languages all around the world. And I want to emphasize, when we're teaching, you'll notice I demonstrated with bookface and cursive. We are introducing them simultaneously. And again, it's like that idea that those ducks are all different. Or if you saw the neuroscience of reading one, dogs, so many different types of breeds of dogs, and yet students recognize them all. Mm-hmm. That same thing happens with letters.
Yeah, that's interesting. Very interesting. Okay, do these steps apply to teaching manuscript, cursive, or both?
Both. Mm-hmm. So just like if I was showing those strokes for cursive, same strokes. If you're teaching in in manuscript, it becomes start at the midline, down to the baseline, pick up the pencil dot, and we have a cursive, a manuscript handwriting chart. I can't find it right now, but it looks the same. And we have all these things on cards too. So, there's the manuscript cards that break it all down in the same way. So here's it. And there's the steps. Same exact teaching process. And I would like to emphasize it's the process that's most important, the systematic instruction, not choosing cursive or manuscripts.
Okay, I've had several students, grade 3 and up, say that their teacher wants them to print, not to use cursive. Any advice?
I don't have any advice for the teacher who doesn't want to read their work in cursive. But in that case, obviously the student's probably going to need to master Manuscript well, right? So that systematic instruction in Manuscript will be helpful. And I like to facilitate conversations across the school. I like to get grades sitting down together and talking about the goals of handwriting instruction and making sure that we're all aligned within the same schools about what our goals are and what are the goals for kindergarten and first grade and second grade, and how those fit together so that students are having a cohesive instructional experience, right? So I would, if possible in your district, I would have maybe try to facilitate some of those discussions and then see if you can align instruction across grades and across classrooms.
How should we determine letter order with handwriting letter formation versus how our current curriculum introduces letter sounds with reading and decoding skills?
Yeah, I guess in the ideal world, I would introduce them based on relationship of strokes. However, I would still teach anything systematically. So if you have a curriculum that's introducing the sounds, I would still teach how to write that sound systematically when it's taught. Does that make sense? And draw connections to the strokes and the handwriting. So if I had to, mix that up a little bit, I'd still go to systematic instruction of those letters in the order that they're being introduced to help them with the reading skill.
What letter order do you recommend when teaching Manuscript?
Yeah, Manuscript, I wish I could find what I did with the chart, but Manuscript also has, here, no. Manuscript also has a discrete set of strokes, and you can start with any stroke and any letter. I just encourage you to group them together. Does that make sense? So in our Manuscript program, it starts with the straight stroke, which then forms, all of these letters. But you could start with roll too. There's no problem with that, and start with an A. And there's others, like D, that start with the exact same stroke.
Okay, do you know of any studies that emphasize the importance of cursive writing? Many districts in my area took cursive out of the curriculum.
Yeah, I don't have my research database at my fingertips. There's a number of articles that I could send maybe to Donna for you about some of this. And I know that even if you Google it, there's been some New York Times articles and other articles about the importance of cursive as well from many different perspectives. And I think if you Google even dyslexia and cursive, you'll see there's some research on the benefits of cursive for students with dyslexia. And yeah, so sorry that I don't have a study at my fingertips today.
Yeah, no, I've heard that too. It just solidifies that connection. And especially like when you're saying the sounds, when you're writing the strokes, it's all about making that sound and letter connection together. It just solidifies all that.
Yeah, and a really interesting story. I was working with a school that was like 98% free and reduced lunch, and just a lot of struggling readers and struggling students. And I was kind of surprised. They decided to adopt cursive from the beginning, but what surprised me was the huge response from parents just a few weeks in, because all of a sudden they had these young students writing in this beautiful handwriting, and it was something that the parents saw evidence of really quickly. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And that created this feedback loop from the parents to the teachers, and the teachers then who are resistant to teaching systematic handwriting began to hear this kind of buzz, and they began to teach handwriting, and then you just walk the halls, and I was blown away. But handwriting has these bigger impacts, right, on how students feel about themselves and their education, as well as the way it connects into the neuroscience of reading.
It's true. Very interesting. I think that's it.
All right.
Any more questions? All right, we want to, well, say thank you and remind everyone that we have Denise is coming back very quickly, actually. In June, she will be doing 2 events, one on June 10th. She's going to explain her Foundations of Logic of English program, correct? And on June 23rd, she's going to introduce her Essentials Logic of English program. So don't want to miss that. Those are free. I posted those today, so you can find that. And there will be a Google form because I want to make sure everyone can get in and nothing naughty happens. And then on July 12th and 14th, she's going to be doing the Sounding Out Sight Words book study. So she'll be teaching you that. And that will be a paid event. It's only $15 and you need to buy the book, correct?
Yeah.
The book will help. And so we'll be getting all that information out to you like in the next week or so. Okay. All right.
Thank you, Donna.
Oh, thank you. It's been fun and enlightening, and we had a lot of response, positive response to this series. Thanks for everything. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.